welcome. I'm Wynn Kane, president of the League of Women Voters of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area. The League is pleased to bring you this evening's program, Money in Politics, Its Impact on Gun Safety Policy. We're delighted you could join us for this evening's important discussion with our featured speakers, U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, our senior senator from Illinois, Representative Brad Schneider of the Illinois 10th Congressional District, and Lake Forest High School student Elizabeth Porter. May I remind you that the League membership is open to both men and women, and the League is a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. If you're interested in public policy issues or being engaged in the political process, please think about joining us. There are membership brochures on the back table, or go to our site for more information and follow us on Facebook. The League offers a variety of activities throughout the year. There's voter registration, candidate debates, public programs, and discussion groups. The program this evening is being videotaped, recorded by William Schellhaus Media, and will be shown on Channel 17 and 19 in Lake Forest. Will be on our website and on YouTube. Now at this time, I'd like to introduce our program chairman, Joy Guscott Mueller, who will introduce our speakers and moderate this evening's program. Thank you. Joy?
Thank you, Wynn. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here today for Money in Politics, Its Impact on Gun Safety Policy. It's a very important topic that's in the news today, and I think one that has really engaged and revitalized the conversation surrounding this issue. As Wynn indicated, we are open to women and men starting at the age of 16, and we hope all of you will consider joining us. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on YouTube and on our website. Before we begin, I want to thank, in addition to our distinguished panel, fellow Vice Presidents of Program Sharon Board and Carol Gale, all of our volunteers this evening, the Board of Directors for the League of Women Voters, Gorton community staff, and all of those who have made this possible. We have a couple of housekeeping matters. At the League, what we do in terms of receiving questions is we have index cards. You may have picked one up when you came in. We will also have volunteers walking across the aisles. Just raise your hand if you have a question and you would like a card, or you can raise it now if you think you'll have a question. You write it down, and then if you have a question, raise your hand. The volunteers will come and collect it, and then they will be organized and brought up. And at the conclusion of all three of our speakers, I will direct questions to the speakers based on those questions submitted by you. In the wake of the recent mass shooting in a Florida high school and the response of students and young people throughout the country to the tragic mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, we are driving a new discussion about gun violence, prevention, gun safety, policy, and legislation. Gun violence prevention and gun safety legislation, as well as money in politics, are program areas in which our membership educates and advocates nationally and at the local level. For this program, the League of Women Voters zeroes in on the influence of money in shaping our public policy, specifically as it relates to gun violence prevention and gun safety. It should be noted also that the League has developed its position regarding gun control, gun safety, and so forth as a result of extensive debate and consensus building at all of the local chapters. It goes up through the local chapters, through the states, and at the national level is once again debated, and a consensus is reached regarding each of our positions. And it comes about as a result of bipartisan decision-making from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. I'm so happy to have our panelists here this evening, Senator Dick Durbin, Congressman Brad Schneider, and Elizabeth Porter, and we're so grateful for your participation today. We're going to begin this evening with Elizabeth Porter, Elizabeth Porter is a senior at Lake Forest High School and a lifelong resident of Lake Bluff. Ms. Porter has written for the Forest Scout for the past 2 years, including many editorials. She is a National Merit Finalist, a member of the National Honor Society, Cum Laude Society, and a varsity athlete. What is relevant today is that she helped publicize and participate in the Lake Forest High School walkout on March 14, 2018, in protest against gun violence and to commemorate the tragic loss in Parkland, Florida. We will hear her perspective this evening, and that will serve as the backdrop for the remarks that we will hear from our elected representatives. Elizabeth will attend Georgetown University in the fall, which is, I believe, the alma mater of Senator Durbin. So they're in good company with one another. So I would like to have you join me in a warm welcome, Elizabeth Porter.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for providing me with the opportunity to be here tonight. And thank you to Representative Schneider and Senator Durbin for all of your work on behalf of the people of Illinois. I, like many of you in this room right now, have never known the terror of looking down the barrel of a gun. I have never watched helplessly while someone I knew bled to death. I, like many of you, have never known the trauma and nightmares and fear and guilt that countless Americans who have lost someone to gun violence or who have lived through gun violence live with every day. But we've all watched from a distance as the unimaginable scenes flash across our TV screens and our nation mourns again. High school seniors today were born in the year of the Columbine shooting. We grew up practicing active shooter drills, cowering in the corner of dark, locked classrooms. Since elementary school, once a year, some authority figure would come over the intercom and say, "We will now commence our Code Red active shooter drill." We thought out and discussed what we would do while we waited. I wonder how many of us could fit in those cabinets. Do you think we could barricade the door with those desks? Maybe we could stab them with scissors. I heard you should play dead. Don't tell anyone, but the big recycling can is my hiding place. We would wait for the footsteps of police officers or administrators combing through the hallways to wiggle door handles, peer inside windows, and listen for murmurs, eventually deeming our performance satisfactory and releasing us from our corner to go back to our lessons. I remember learning about Sandy Hook one day when I came home from 6th grade and the TV was on. I remember texting my fellow 12-year-olds and being sad as I watched President Obama tear up later that night as he promised change that never came. When I was 16, 762 people were murdered with guns in the city of Chicago, a 2-decade high. When I was 17, my friends and I realized that Stephen Paddock had rented out rooms in a hotel overlooking Lollapalooza before murdering 58 concertgoers in Las Vegas instead. We shuddered knowing that it could have been Chicago, and it could have been us. Tragedy after tragedy, we became desensitized, only expressing shock when the death toll was high enough. Tragedy after tragedy, it became painfully clear to us that nothing was being done and that nothing would be done. We were smart enough and cynical enough to realize that the gun lobby had their claws so deep in the careers and livelihoods and reputations of so many of our elected officials that we couldn't count on them to do anything for us, for the people they were supposedly elected to serve. America's gun problem isn't just about mass shootings. those are simply the only things to capture our attention. America's gun problem is about the 96 people who die every day in this country from gunshot wounds. It's about the women who are 5 times as likely to die in a domestic violence situation if the perpetrator has access to a gun. It's about how suicide attempts using guns are deadly 90% of the time, while suicide attempts across other means are deadly 10% of the time. And it's about the 70% of suicide attempt survivors who never attempted again, but wouldn't have gotten that second chance at life if they had used a gun. And it's about Black Americans, who make up 13% of our population, yet over half of our gun homicide victims. The most aggravating thing about these horrifying statistics is how clear the potential solutions to these problems are. There are countless proposed measures, including improved background checks, making licenses mandatory, requiring secure storage, or banning high-capacity magazines that experts have agreed will prevent gun deaths without infringing on law-abiding Americans' right to bear arms. But our country is flooded with guns. We have almost as many guns as we do people. To truly remedy our gun violence problem, we would likely need to do something more drastic, like Australia did in 1996 with their mandatory buybacks following a mass shooting. But recent events have shown that Americans are inclined to buy more guns after mass shootings instead of getting them off our streets. Regardless, even basic gun control measures will save lives and are worth fighting for. Gun control doesn't have to be a politically divisive issue. All Americans with common sense who value life and safety can come together in favor of basic gun control legislation. In fact, a recent NPR survey found that 75% of Americans favor overall stricter gun laws, with 94% in favor of mandatory background checks, 82% in favor of raising the minimum age to buy a gun to 21, and 72% in favor of banning assault rifles, to name a few. Again, these are nowhere near perfect solutions, but the bipartisan public support is overwhelming. So why then have none of these measures been passed at the federal level? I've got 3 letters for you. NRA. For 100 years, it functioned as a marksmanship club, but in the 1970s, the NRA became a powerful, relentless political lobbying group. In order to sell guns, they sell fear. Fear of the government, fear of invasion, fear of the man living next door. They contribute heavily to candidates who will do their bidding and have outspent gun control groups by 40 times for the 2018 elections so far. But arguably more important than their money are their 5 million highly motivated voters. Not only are politicians afraid of losing campaign contributions, they're afraid of losing NRA votes, which can be a very powerful voice in a closely divided electorate. Do you know what's really messed up? The month after the Parkland shooting, in which 17 people were killed in a high school, the NRA raised $2.4 million by fundraising, their highest monthly total in over 15 years. That's the NRA's power today, but maybe, just maybe, not for long. When Parkland happened, I assumed it would be like other national tragedies, covered in the media for a week or two and then forgotten. But that's not what happened. This time, something was different. The survivors took control of their narrative. They refused to be forgotten or bullied into submission by conspiracy theorists who insisted it was fake, or politicians and news commentators who tweeted offensive personal attacks. Thanks to the persistent effort of these survivors and their supporters across the country, real change has actually been made since then. For instance, Florida Governor Rick Scott signed a bill to raise the minimum age to buy a gun in Florida to 21, introduce 3-day waiting periods, ban bump stocks, allow police to seize guns from potentially dangerous people, and increase funding for school safety and mental health services. Beyond Florida, many other states have passed gun control legislation, and many large businesses have changed their policies or publicly cut ties with the NRA. So how did the Parkland survivors accomplish this? Largely, it seems, using social media. We often hear about how bad social media is. Parents hate it, teachers hate it, even I hate it sometimes. However, we can't ignore the fact that it helps level the playing field made so unequal by money. Organizing, lobbying, and buying advertising is the expensive, laborious work of PACs and lobbyists, but the Parkland students have demonstrated that by using social media to communicate their story, advocate for what they believe in, and motivate their peers, that work can be done more quickly and effectively. Using social media, a bunch of teenagers can beat a pro-gun lobby with a $250 million budget at their own game, and in doing so, force political powers to listen and respond. Without social media, March for Our Lives never would have caught on. Without it, Lake Forest High School and Lake Bluff Middle School students would not have been able to plan and publicize their very own walkouts as part of the national walkouts on March 14th. While hundreds of students chose to remain inside, hundreds more braved the cold to stand in silent solidarity for 17 minutes in honor of the lives lost in Parkland. This video, shot by LFHS senior Annalise Craig, exemplifies the ability of students to use the internet to share their stories with the world. The gun control debate has been raging for a long time in America, but students have been a spark to reignite that flame. And that should give us hope. Despite the statistics and the powers that be, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because of my fellow students, including Aiden Kinsella, who led a group of students to vote at City Hall on March 14th, despite the threat of consequences. I'm optimistic because Grant Hubner stood outside, alone, for hours, with a poster demanding change on the 19th anniversary of Columbine. I'm optimistic because Kate Stevenson wrote a beautiful song about the heart-wrenching realities of gun violence and performed it for hundreds of people to see. I'm optimistic because I know my classmates and our peers across the country will not give up this fight. And I'm optimistic because even though the walkout was certainly not popular with everyone, it started some very important conversations. Finally, I'm optimistic because support for gun control is highest among 18 to 29-year-olds. And while we're also the least active voters, I predict that is going to change. These teenagers, this generation, the Parkland generation, will be at the polls this year and on the ballot in 10 years. Because we know that the best way to ensure NRA money doesn't control our representatives is to elect representatives who won't be controlled by NRA money. Together, we must continue to fight in honor of the victims of gun violence who no longer can. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for that offering. Really, very powerful. And I think you fellas have some competition coming up. Elizabeth has really beautifully set out the student perspective on this issue. And the statistics she provided, I recently read as well, and it does beg the question, what's standing in the way of passage of legislation and reform of our gun policy in light of those statistics. And so we're going to talk to the folks who are in the trenches right now. And hopefully they can inform us on what's going on and their victories and their challenges. And we're so grateful to have both Senator Durbin and Congressman Schneider here to provide that perspective. Brad Schneider represents Illinois' 10th district in the United States House of Representatives, where he is serving his second term. Congressman Schneider serves on the House Committee on the Judiciary, the House Committee on Small Business, and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Prior to being elected to Congress, Brad spent more than 20 years in business and management consulting, helping large and family-owned businesses alike address the challenges of today's economy and plan for the future. His professional experience has allowed him to see firsthand the challenges small businesses face when trying to hire new workers and grow their company, as well as the effect thriving small businesses can have on a community's overall economy. At home, Brad has deep ties to the community, including service with organizations such as the Jewish United Fund, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the Waukegan Public Library Foundation, BEST, the Coalition to Reduce Recidivism, and the Civic Leadership Foundation. Congressman Schneider earned a BS in Industrial Engineering and his MBA from Northwestern University. Congressman Schneider and his wife Julie have been residents of Deerfield for more than 25 years, where they created a home, built their careers, and most importantly, raised two sons, Adam and Daniel. One of Brad's favorite pastimes was coaching his sons' baseball and soccer teams for over 12 years. He now enjoys exploring the bike trails throughout the district. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Brad Schneider of the 10th District.
Thank you very much. To the League, thank you for everything you do every day. I'll come back to that in a second. Elizabeth asked us if we still get nervous, and I said, sure. But I didn't realize how nervous I needed to be. That was just an incredible, remarkable statement you made. And I have no doubt you're going to continue to lead and continue to make a difference. I wish you luck at Georgetown. But thank you for sharing your stories with us. So my connection to this, I am named after my mother's uncle, Sam. My middle name's Scott, it's the initial S. Sam in 1942 was working in his office when a gunman walked in and shot him 4 times. So it's a personal issue, something I've been focused on pretty much all of my life, the issue of gun violence. When it came time to run for office and we wanted to talk about my experience and talk about my Uncle Sam, before I would do that and we put it in our mail, I called home and I asked my mom, and I have 3 surviving aunts, how they felt about it. Would it be okay? And it was if I had opened a wound 70 years later, like it was opened yesterday. You never recover from losing someone to gun violence. And yet, here we are at 2018, and it continues day in and day out around our country with no abatement. I grew up in Colorado. I went to a rival high school to Columbine. So when the Columbine shooting happened in 1999, that hit close to home as well. But that was a stunning shock. I was elected in 2012 in November and December, almost exactly a month later. I was at orientation for new incoming members when my colleague Elizabeth Esty looked at her phone at breakfast and said, oh my God, there was a shooting in my district, and it looks like someone might have been hurt. By the time she got to Connecticut, we learned that 20 first graders had been murdered, along with 6 teachers. And when I got to office in January, I saw the parents from Newtown come to the Capitol to speak to the senators and the representatives and make the case why we need gun violence. Now, mind you, this wasn't new to me. I've been working on this my entire life, but I had never heard such passion, such emotion as parents who had lost 6-year-old children to random gun violence when a shooter walks into what should be the most safe place on earth, their elementary school. And yet, it took 6 months, but at the end of 6 months, the NRA had successfully shut it down and ended any chance we had of of trying to bring just common sense steps to reduce gun violence. A few years later, we had the shooting in Orlando, the Pulse nightclub. Young people celebrating with each other, enjoying life when a gunman walked in and walked through the club, shooting randomly, ending young lives. It took 9 days for the NRA to shut down any discussion of action. Las Vegas, you mentioned the shooting in Las Vegas. That was, in 2017, the 273rd mass shooting in the United States that year. Think about that. And it continues, and yet nothing is getting done. And then on February 14th in Parkland, Florida, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School, news came that there was yet one more shooting. 19-year-old former student walked in and had killed what turns out to be 17 people. But this time something's different. Something's dramatically different. And people talk, what might it be? Well, we saw tonight what's different. It's the voices of these children. Excuse me. I've met the Newtown kids. They came to Washington. They shared their stories. I called to all of the high school principals in our district and say, what are you doing? How can I help you? Some schools had walkouts, some schools had sit-ins, some schools tried to find ways to let the students express their voice. And over the last 2 months, what we've seen are young people, in many cases of the men, young people too young to shave, looking to us as the adults and saying, what are you going to do to make our lives safe? Revolutions typically start by students. Now, I joke, I say it's usually students in college wanting to take their ideas and turn the world upside down. We're seeing a revolution happen now of young students saying, this isn't the world we deserve. We're going to turn our world and collectively our nation right side up. If there's a chance to make a difference, this is what's going to make it happen. And we have seen, as Elizabeth noted, some of the change. We saw the change in Florida, where Governor Scott signed legislation that he wasn't too keen on signing. But those students went to Tallahassee, and they looked him in the eye and said, we're not going to take it anymore. This year, we have seen some steps in the United States Congress. The spending bill that passed included legislation that will allow the CDC to collect data on gun violence, so we can understand what's happening. So if we have the understanding, we can start taking some specific actions. But the NRA is not backing down. The NRA continues to raise money, continues to threaten. Now, Elizabeth, I didn't have, I think, the same academic record you had. I joke I was only 1 point away from a 4.0. I had a 3.0. But I didn't get any Fs, at least not that I will confess to. But when I got to Congress, I got an F that I brag about, and I'm very proud of. The NRA deemed my position worthy of an F grade because I'm not afraid of them. I'm not going to stand down and say, well, they might come and challenge me. Because what we're talking about are people's lives. We're talking about the lives of our students. We're talking about the lives of people in our communities. 96 people every day. 2/3 of those suicides. Now, I mentioned I'm named after my mother's uncle, my grandmother's brother. My grandmother had 18 grandchildren. We've lost one to mental illness because he was able to go and get a gun and take his own life. We can take steps to save lives by having universal background checks. We can take steps to save lives by making those large capacity magazines that allow someone to walk into a movie theater and shoot 70 rounds in less than a minute and then disappear out the exit door. We can save lives by making it illegal to traffic guns across state lines. But we can only do that if we're willing to stand up and make a difference. I said I was going to come back and talk about the League of Women Voters. One of our challenges is making sure that everybody votes. Because Elizabeth shared the numbers. Universal background checks has 90% support. Other steps are 70, 80% support. And yet we see time and time again members of Congress fearful that they're going to lose their seat. The NRA spends a lot of money. By the way, Stephen wrote a beautiful speech. I'm not giving it, but if you see him, thank him for writing the speech for me. But Stephen's my speechwriter. The NRA contributed $23 million in direct spending to candidates. In just the 2016 cycle, it put additional $54 million in outside expenditures. And that was in comparison to the $4 million that the common sense pro-gun legislation groups are able to match. We need to make sure that everyone votes. That's what the League of Women Voters is all about. If we're going to make a difference, we need to make sure that the voices like Elizabeth and the students at Lake Forest High School, that the voices of these Parkland students, that the voices Senator Durbin and I were at Woodland Middle School today, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, who ask questions about gun violence that middle schoolers shouldn't be thinking about. Raise your hand if you know what a lockdown is. Keep your hand up if you know the difference between a soft and a hard lockdown. Okay, I didn't know what the difference between a soft and a hard lockdown is. I was taught today by a 6th grade student, because they have to understand the language, that a soft lockdown means that there's a shooter in the area, and a hard lockdown means there's a shooter in your school. Our kids shouldn't be learning this. Our kids should be learning to appreciate the arts and sciences. They should be learning to appreciate the ability to think critically and make decisions about civics and politics and opportunity. Our kids should be learning to have dreams and what it's going to take to achieve them. And yet we have to teach them what they have to do to protect them from nightmares. This isn't the future we should be giving our children. We need to stand up to the NRA. But the only way we stand up to the NRA is to amplify the voices of Parkland, make sure that we all vote, make sure that our neighbors vote, our coworkers vote, our children and our parents vote. And if our voices are heard and if our votes are counted, then the NRA doesn't stand a chance. I'll continue to introduce legislation, like the legislation that will allow government to be notified when someone buys multiple long guns, rifles, or the like. Today, it's only true if you buy handguns. That's not acceptable. I'll continue to introduce legislation on background checks. I'll introduce legislation that the Sun-Times said was so obvious, it's amazing that it's even necessary. That gun dealers and gun manufacturers lock their inventory at the end of the day when they go home. But we can't get support for that. And in 2016, 18,000 guns were lost or stolen. We're going to make progress. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy. But as long as we have the voices of these students, and as long as we, the people who have gone before them, are willing to join them and stand up and speak out, we will defeat the NRA. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Schneider. Our next speaker is Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. Senator Durbin, a Democrat from Springfield, is the 47th senator from the state of Illinois, the state senior senator, and the convener of Illinois' bipartisan congressional delegation. Mr. Durbin also serves as the Democratic whip, the second highest ranking position among Senate Democrats. Senator Durbin has been elected to this leadership post by his Democratic colleagues every 2 years since 2005. Elected to the U.S. Senate on November 5th, 1996, and re-elected in 2002, 2008, and 2014, Durbin fills the seat left vacant by the retirement of his longtime friend and mentor, U.S. Senator Paul Simon. Senator Durbin sits on the Senate Judiciary, Appropriations, and Rules Committee. He is the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Immigration and the Appropriations Committee's Defense Subcommittee. Senator Durbin makes approximately 50 round trips a year between Washington and Illinois. He is married to Loretta Schaefer Durbin. Their family consists of 3 children, Christine, who is deceased, Paul and Jennifer, as well as 3 grandchildren, Alex, Anna, and Floyd. They reside in Springfield. Please join me in welcoming Senator Dick Durbin.
Thanks for that nice introduction. I want to start off by expressing my gratitude to the founding fathers of the United States who crafted our Constitution, which guides our country. And in their extraordinary wisdom in drawing up that document, which we have relied on for more than 2 centuries, they made the express decision that no one can run for the United States Senate until they reach the age of 30 years. That, of course, means that Elizabeth Porter cannot run against me for at least 10 or 12 years. And I am relieved to know. Brad, thanks for your great comments and heartfelt comments about this issue. It was about 6 weeks ago, and I was in New York to see my grandkids with my wife, and was invited on Morning Joe, and some of you watched that. So I went to the NBC building at Rockefeller Plaza, and as I got out of the car and walked in, I saw this young man walking across the lobby, and I recognized him. And I went up to him and said, aren't you David Hogg from Parkland, Florida, the high school? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, well, I'm Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois. I just wanted to say hello to you. And he looked me in the eye and he said, did you ever take any money from the NRA? I said, no, I didn't, and I never planned to. Where do you get your money, he said. I said, from the usual sources and a lot of good people, but never, ever from the gun lobby. And I thought to myself, he was obviously overwhelmed by my presence in front of him, humbled at the thought of shaking hands with the United States Senator, and couldn't wait to confront me, this high school student from Florida. That's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. It's a valuable thing. And as Elizabeth describes what's happening in Lake Forest and in surrounding communities, it really tells us we've reached a tipping point. And how many times have you asked yourself, won't this be enough? Won't the killing of those innocent first graders be enough that finally America will say, never again? Wasn't that killing at Columbine High School enough? Wasn't the deadly killing that occurred in Las Vegas enough? No, sadly, they weren't. But it took that particular experience in Florida to create a new force in American politics, a new voice in American politics, these young people who stepped up and were not exactly overwhelmed by their adult superiors and had a few things to say about this country that we live in. They've been castigated and criticized and even ridiculed. They've been criticized on some of these television networks unfairly, but it doesn't seem to have discouraged them one single bit. They've continued, the young women and the young men, to come forward and to confront us as they should. I, as I mentioned earlier, am lucky enough to be the grandfather of 3 or 4 of the sweetest little grandkids in the world, and a couple of them happen to be first graders in Brooklyn, New York. And my little granddaughter, Ona, came home from school and said to her mom, first grader, 6 years old, Mom, the teacher told us if there's a shooter with a gun somewhere near our school, we better stay away from the windows. And if she tells us, we're supposed to get on the floor immediately. I can barely remember duck and cover drills when I was a kid in grade school, somehow believing that under the desk we had a better chance to survive a nuclear attack. But I think of those things with some amusement. I don't find any amusement in the thought that my 6-year-old granddaughter is being warned about what is becoming a reality in America today. 187,000 students in this country have been in the school buildings when the shooters have entered. Thank goodness the overwhelming majority have survived, but as we know, many of them did not. And they are telling us it is time for a change, and it is. How can anyone rationalize that the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution ever envisioned what we're talking about tonight? I can't. And let me just say flat out, I don't have any objection to people who legally own a gun, store it and use it safely for sports, for hunting, for self-defense. I don't own a gun, but I don't begrudge them that decision. But what the courts have told us and said in very clear terms, it is not an absolute right. It is within our power as voters and our government's power as we elect them to come up with reasonable restrictions. For the longest time, we had a restriction which said, and still does, you can't own a machine gun, an automatic weapon where you just hold the trigger and the bullets just fly. But then came Las Vegas, and really realized that someone had invented a little device called a bump stock, which uses the vibration of the gun to make it an automatic weapon and to defeat the very law banning machine guns that we passed 80 years ago in the United States of America. I find it incredible that we are even considering the possibility that people could own these high-capacity ammunition clips. If you want to own a handgun, and I hope you don't, but if you wish, I can't imagine why you need a clip with 30 rounds in it. And those are available for these handguns. The list goes on and on. You've seen what these weapons look like. I've said, gotten in trouble for it, but I've said if you need a military assault weapon to shoot a deer, you ought to stick to fishing. You really don't have any expertise at hunting. And there won't be much left of that animal after you've used that weapon on them. And it's interesting as well, I've been out on a few duck hunting trips. The ducks are completely safe when I'm around. But to think that people argue we cannot restrict their right to own and use a firearm. We can't do it. Now, the Supreme Court said the opposite. And I believe the Supreme Court's right. But there are people who make the argument it's just one little step away from taking our guns away. Do you know what the rules are if you want to shoot a duck? You know what the rules are in Arkansas, one of the key places people go to shoot a duck? Let me tell you a few of the rules that you have to play by now to shoot a duck in the state of Arkansas. You get 30 days a year to do it. That's it. 1 month. You have to pay $100 in state and federal licensing fees. They then tell you the type of gun, shotgun, that you can use. It can only have 3 rounds. And those 3 rounds cannot contain lead pellets. And if you want to shoot a duck, you can't do it more than 15 minutes before the sun rises. And when the ducks fly overhead, there are a limited number that you can shoot, and certain types you're not supposed to shoot. In some states, you can't shoot a duck on a Sunday. I'm not making this up. The list goes on and on. Hunters apparently think these are totally acceptable rules when it comes to ducks. So what is wrong with us in this country that we aren't setting rules when it comes to our children and protecting them when it comes to the use of firearms? I'm going to end because we've had some great comments and I know you have lots of questions. It is the league after all. But I will say this to you. The question was, what about the money involved in this? It's a big part of the problem, a huge part of the problem. But it's not a part of the problem that we cannot address. My friend, my predecessor, Paul Simon, 22 years ago said, I'm getting out of this business of the U.S. Senate because I don't want to keep raising the money for these campaigns. I know the feeling that Paul had. Brad knows it as well. We live in a world where campaigns, Susan Garrett knows it from her experience as well. We live in a world where the cost of campaigns has gone up dramatically over the years. In this last campaign cycle, the National Rifle Association spent $55 million. Some 30 million of it went to one presidential candidate, and you can guess which one. And they raise the money, and they are conduits for money that go to the people that support their positions. What can the people do across America who disagree with the NRA position? Well, if you have 55 million, please see me afterwards. And we will tell you how you can use it. But it's not quite likely that you do. But there are other ways to do it. When Brad and I were at the Washington Middle School today, these young students, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students, God bless them, said, what can we do? What difference can we make? Well, it gets down to the basics. First, be informed about the candidates' positions on the issues. Find a way to determine whether that candidate for Congress or the legislature has taken a position on something that's important to you, whether it's bump stocks, whether it's sales at gun stores, gun show, loophole, whatever it happens to be. Understand the issue enough to be able to ask the right questions. And then, of course, use your power as an American voter to register. I hope you all are, and I'll bet you are, and to vote, but also to contribute. If we can't find $55 million contributors, we can find perhaps 50 million who are willing to put in $1 or $2 and match the money that's coming up. And you say, well, wait a minute, all the people in this area are just fine in both political parties. Maybe they are, I just don't know. You would know that better because you know the candidates and you've asked the questions. But don't be afraid to direct your own contributions in other places where they're needed. I can tell you a handful of my own colleagues in the United States Senate who voted for gun safety and gun control at their political peril, and they're going to pay a price for it. I hope you'll consider supporting them. And I know it's a bipartisan organization. There are some Republicans who step up and do the right thing on this issue too. They deserve your support if you believe in this issue. This is where a democracy stands up and takes control. In writing that Constitution, they gave us that option. I know tonight that you're understanding that, and that's why you're here. The last point I want to make is this. If any of you are here looking for Tom Skilling, it looks like he's coming up on Saturday, May 19th. But in honor of Tom Skilling, let me quote one of the poets of my generation. You don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind's blowing. And the wind is blowing in America for common sense change when it comes to gun safety. We're going to have our setbacks. We've already had a few since Parkland. But this is a cause that will not end as long as these young people are gaining strength and gaining our support. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your plug for the upcoming program. I appreciate it. We do have many questions, and so we'll begin. One of the questions is directed to Senator Durbin, and I think, though, we can also hear from Congressman Schneider about what's happening in the House. But this questioner said, can you set forth for us the status of your co-sponsored bills introduced this March? Number 1, Automatic Gunfire Prevention Act, 2, Assault Weapons Ban of 2017, and Background Check Completion Act.
Dead on arrival. Going nowhere. The Republicans control the Senate. Mitch McConnell of Kentucky's made it clear there'll be no gun control legislation. None will be scheduled by Chuck Grassley and the Senate Judiciary Committee. That's a reality. We've already passed in the last year, and Brad probably remembers the same provision, watering down the requirement of checking for mental illness of certain Social Security recipients before they're issued gun licenses. We overruled, the Senate did, not our vote by any means, overruled this regulation put in place by the Obama administration to check for people who may be suspect of being mentally unstable. What I think all of this terrible tragedy has done, though, is I hope to finally put an end to what's known as the reciprocity law, which dealt with concealed carry weapons. We allow each state to establish standards for concealed carry permits, and they're virtually different in every state. Some of them are non-existent. All you have to do is ask for the concealed carry permit. In others, you have to go through training and clearances and background checks. So there's a wide disparity. The NRA came in at the beginning of last year and said, we want to give reciprocity. So if you have a concealed carry permit in, take it, Arkansas, with no requirements for background checks, you can take your concealed weapon into the state of Illinois with impunity. That is outrageous. It means that when we've decided standards for the safety of our state, we can't apply them to people who bring guns across the border. It may have already passed the House, but it's not being called in the Senate. And I think the tragedies we face have slowed it down.
So one of our questioners said, is it true that new gun legislation has been postponed until after the midterm elections? And if so, why?
The Republican leaders in the Senate do not want to put their members on the spot if they're in tough states where this may be a contentious issue. So they're going to keep the issue off the floor of the Senate.
So Congressman Schneider, can you report on the status of any legislation in the House that is pending?
I think the answer is the same. The Speaker's not going to bring any legislation to the floor. If you go back to 2013, after the Newtown shooting, under leadership of Mike Thompson, we formed a gun violence prevention task force. We developed legislation that went nowhere. Then this Congress has been more legislation, quite a few number of bills. The Republicans did take action on school safety. In fact, it was called the Secure Our Schools Act. That was a bipartisan bill, or Stop School Violence Act. Within that was a bill I introduced with my colleague Mike Bost on Secure Our Schools that would put the panic buttons in classrooms. So if teachers had an emergency, this could be a health emergency, a crisis in the classroom, or a shooter, we get that information to the first responders much more quickly. They would know where to go. That was able to move, but that had nothing to do with gun violence. That dealt with dealing with some specific safety actions in the schools. There's just such an ability of the NRA and the few minority within the minority caucus to stop it that nothing's going to move, certainly until there's a change of leadership in the House.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple of questions here that I'll ask in tandem for both of you. What are your suggestions on moving gun control legislation forward this year? And I guess given what your answers have been, if any. And another questioner who said, well, what can we do to affect legislative change when our representatives, such as yourselves, are already in favor of sensible gun laws? Do we really need to call our legislative offices, or what should we do?
I'll tell you, it doesn't hurt to call our offices. We appreciate the calls. They are tallied, they are counted, and it helps us make the case. This is where our district is on these issues. Talk to your friends and family in other districts, other states, and make sure they're doing the same. The more the pressure is applied, I think the better our chance of getting something done is. I mentioned earlier the need to have people to vote. And just to try to lay out some of the numbers, imagine a gerrymandered district where 70% of the district is Republican. But still only 20% of that district is so adamant about taking any common steps. Remember, 90% Republicans and Democrats support background checks and things like that. Well, the issue is that those 20% are probably on the Republican side, so it's 2 out of 7 voters. And then in a primary, less than half the voters vote. So instead of 7 people voting, it's going to be 3. But those 2 gun-crazy voters are going to vote. Now you have 2 out of 3 of the voters are taking it. So until we get people out voting on this issue and bringing the same energy and same passion that the NRA voters are bringing, it's going to be hard. So that if we're going to make a change, we need to change the people who are voting, as Elizabeth said so eloquently. Making sure those that are willing to take the risk. Look, I'm proud of my position. I'm proud of my F. I am proud of also my district, though. This is a district that supports me in that position. We need to make sure that those people who are taking the brave positions in more difficult districts have the ability to do so.
Senator Durbin.
I'd be surprised if there's anybody in the room that doesn't get an email once a day asking for a political contribution. Sometimes.
Sorry.
So let me just just say to you, though there may not be anyone you can find quickly in Illinois that you put in the category of having cast a courageous vote for gun safety and has a tough political race, believe me, in the Senate, I can tell you, from the Democratic side, a half dozen who are fighting for their lives, political lives, in this election, and who are going to be dramatically outspent, who have done just that. Just that. Not all of them, not all of them who are for re-election, but a half dozen who I look at and think, my God, they're going to go home and face holy hell over this vote. And if you want to find them, I'm sure there are organizations that you subscribe to and believe in that can identify them for you. If not, I'll try to help.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Elizabeth. There were a few questions for her, and I want to, this questioner asked, given your current experience, Elizabeth, what apart from social media do you believe is the most effective way to implement gun control legislation?
Like I mentioned, sorry, it's loud. Okay, like I mentioned.
Loud is good.
Okay. I think that voting is something that not all people my age are terribly informed about, or, you know, we go off to college and then all of a sudden we're in another state and it's like you have to get the mail-in ballot and people are confused. So I think just really working to get out the vote for young people and make sure that young people are educated on the candidates, like was mentioned before, is a very important way to impact the legislation, and is an impact of the Parkland movement as well.
Thank you. And as the League of Women Voters, you know we're always ready, willing, and able to take your voter registration. So thanks for that lead-in, Elizabeth. I'm going to switch to the other component of this program, which is the money and politics piece, because we're hearing the reality is money does matter in this discussion, and the need to support candidates. This leads me to this question that this questioner had, which is, do you support campaign finance reform legislation, such as a small donor match public funding program? Would either of you like to speak
I'm
to
going to
that?
sponsor that bill in the Senate, public financing bill. And
I was saying that same with in the House. John Sarbanes is the leader of this.
And John and I have similar bills, slightly different bills. When Arlen Specter was around, I could find a Republican co-sponsor. He switched parties and then passed on, and I can't find another one to join me. It is a radical idea, but it's one that would dramatically change this democracy overnight. Matching small donor contributions would put the big boys out of business, and the dark money would be gone forever. But with the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, and the fact that most incumbents believe, as bad as the current system is, it brought them initial election and is likely to give them re-election, it is hard to get this reform movement going. If you're a student of history, you know it takes a major scandal to generate a major reform. We have had so many scandals, I think, unfortunately, we are numb to those scandals at this point, and I don't know what would bring about great reform. But I favor it. I think it is the best way to approach this. It really would democratize not only the contributions, but ultimately the election process.
And I'll just add, our district here is one of the most expensive districts in the country. It has historically been that. In the 3 campaigns between me and Bob Dole, $60 million, all money in, what we raised. First pause to think about all the significant things we could be doing, investing that money in other places. Both of us were successful in good fundraisers. I will tell you, in a heartbeat, we need to change the way we fund our campaigns. We need to make sure that the voices being heard in the campaign are those of the candidate, not these outside groups that Citizens United empowers. We need to make sure that the people making the decisions who represents them are the voters. And again, not these outside groups who no one knows who they are.
And so the League of Women Voters, I think, is optimistic by nature, given that the woman's right to vote was DOA for many, many, many years. And so, notwithstanding what your report is, what is the best way to get big money out of politics. What can we help how can we help make that happen?
Elizabeth, this one's all yours.
Sorry, panel.
No, and we need to change the leadership in the House. It's and in the Senate, but I'll speak to the House. We need to make sure we're electing people who are committed to campaign finance reform, who are willing to say, you know, if we have, whether it's publicly funded elections or matching funds, it means that someone who is not as well funded as I am, for example, is going to have a better chance of challenging me. That's okay, because we need to have, I joke and say, this is the longest job interview process I've ever had, and it happens every 2 years. That's the way the process is supposed to work. That's how we make sure that we have people who represent our values and our priorities in Washington fighting for those values and priorities. So it's just, we need to make sure we're electing people willing to take the step and commit to campaign finance reform.
Thank you. This question, the audience member wants to know, is Citizens United limiting the ability to track NRA contributions? Do you
Well,
know the answer to that?
Citizens United said basically two things. The first thing it said was that money equals speech, and secondly, that you could not limit a corporate person's ability to speak as much as they wanted to, which meant no limits. And then we managed to create, through the tax code and other means, dark money sources in campaigns, and that was the end of the ballgame. At that point, there's no way to track what's coming in or what's being spent. There are so many different forms of PACs that are available today. Some of them are disclosed and some aren't. Most of them appear to be legal post-Citizens United. How do you change that? It's a long-term commitment. It's a long-term commitment that involves the future of the Supreme Court, for example. When the vacancy of Anton Scalia went unfilled for a year, it was specifically designed to make sure that it would be filled perhaps by a new president, and they hoped it would be someone of their political faith, and it worked out that way with Mr. Gorsuch. We have people on the court who are at retirement age, so to speak, and vulnerable to vicissitudes of life, and I worry about where this is going. It could go from bad to worse. I'm hoping it'll go the other way, and that means elections. Elections that make a difference, and that's what the Constitution gives us as the tool.
We have several questions that ask, is the something along the lines of, is the source of NRA money tracked? I am thinking Russian money as well as domestic. Is the NRA receiving funding from Russia?
I don't have any evidence of that whatsoever. But I would not be surprised if money comes to the NRA from other sources and is then funneled by them to their favorite candidates. That can happen. When I ran for re-election the last time, a fellow to the date I'd never heard of, named Richard Uline, decided to spend $1 million in ads against me. I'd never met the man. I had no idea what he was all about. Is your name? Congratulations. But
This is his town.
the amount of money that some people are putting into these races that can't be traced goes through entities that sound normal, mainstream names that you should maybe see pop up in the air, but really identifying the sources in many cases is next to impossible.
Last year, we did a film screening in Northbrook. I don't know if any of you were able to make it, of a movie called Making a Killing, Guns, Greed, and the NRA. And one of the points that this film was trying to emphasize is that much of the money the NRA has is coming from gun manufacturers. People who have a vested interest in, or companies that have a vested interest in people buying guns. 350 million people in the country, 300 million guns in the country. Many people have hoards, arsenals of guns, and want more. Again, as Elizabeth mentioned, they breed on fear, and that fear, one of the fears is they're coming to take your guns away. You need more guns to defend yourself. we need to make sure that we're putting a spotlight, a Klieg light on where this money is coming from, and transparency is a key piece of that.
There's one other element to mention too. Guns are different than virtually any other product sold in America. If I were to grab this microphone here and be electrocuted to death, there's a hell of a good lawsuit waiting against the person who made this microphone. If I grabbed instead a gun and it went off in my hand with the safety on, where it was supposed to protect me, I cannot bring a products liability suit against the gun industry. They have been protected from that, from the negligence that other manufacturers face every single day. So they not only have volume sales to look for, they have special treatment under the law that no other product enjoys.
This question is directed to Congressman Schneider regarding your passage of the legislation with Congressman Post. What is a panic button, and what does your legislation accomplish promoting this?
So as members of Congress in our office, we have a button under our desk. If someone comes in a threatening situation, we can alert first responders immediately. And I'm assuming the decision to make sure that every member of Congress has such a button was a consequence of the shooting of Gabby Gifford now 8 years ago. The idea that as a member of Congress I have that ability to get immediate response only seems to make sense that our school teachers in classrooms should have the same opportunity. Thank you. So what this does is provides funds for the schools to put those buttons. And the idea is it's faster response. We're not dictating the technology, but my assumption of technology is if classroom 222, if you remember that TV show, if in room 222, that teacher pressed the button, it's different than a first responder getting to a school and saying there's a shooting at Ellis Elementary School, where do I go? So the idea is just try to, again, when it comes to dealing with guns, we have to do everything we can, every little step, to try to save a life.
Thank you. The next question is, I guess they're really searching for ideas here on how to find a common sense gun law that's not partisan, and how can we change the discussions so we can find common ground? For instance, how can you restrict guns at the Capitol and protect elected officials, but allow guns in schools and movie theaters? Isn't that a case of a commonality?
We decided not to allow the members of the NRA to bring their concealed carry weapons in when the president and vice president spoke. The standards obviously are not consistent, and they don't make any common sense as far as I'm concerned. We were the last state in the nation to have concealed carry, and I think it was a ridiculous decision that we were pushed into. I think we're trying to make the best of it in our state, but I don't feel any safer with the notion that even people who've gone through the training are carrying guns into public places. It just, to me, makes no sense. You can limit their access. I think there's a limitation we learned today, obvious limitation of legally bringing guns into schools unless you're a law enforcement agent. But that, I think, ought to be extended. I'm sorry we've reached this point.
And I'll just add, specifically with schools, we need to be investing in training our teachers to teach our children not to carry guns. And I've spoken to many teachers and administrators saying that if they're expected to carry a gun, they're going to retire and find another career. We need to keep our schools safe. We need to make sure that the security or the student resource officers in our schools have the training they need and deserve, but our teachers need to be teachers.
Thank you. I have a question for Elizabeth. Are you aware of any youth initiatives regarding gun safety modeled on youth and government efforts in which young people are suing state and federal governments for violating their constitutional rights? Any thoughts on whether this might work? I guess the question is, Have you found in your research and your work on this issue, active steps that students are taking to make an impact?
I would say that I have not heard of something like that, but if it exists, let me know, because I would like to be part of it. I think part of the frustration students feel, especially students who aren't 18, is that they have this passion and this energy and they have educated themselves, but they don't necessarily have the means to be as vocal as they would like to be. And through the walkout, we had a little bit of that opportunity, and I went to an event that State Senator Julie Morrison hosted a few weeks ago where she asked students, what she could do to support us. So we appreciate things like that, but I don't think that there's enough organization yet, at least here. I'm sure the Parkland students have their outlets, but I think something like that is a great idea, but we don't necessarily have it yet, at least that I'm aware of.
Thank you. There is a question here that says, I support gun control, but why are we vilifying the NRA? Aren't they just a group of citizens making their voices heard? Would anyone like to speak to that issue?
Let me say this, as a downstate, born and raised in downstate, there is a different feeling about firearms in parts of our country and certainly parts of our state. There are family traditions here, which some of us have not been part of, and some of us will never understand. But they are family traditions that are legitimate and safe and legal and sensible. And I always want to be respectful of that because, as I said earlier, I believe there is a way to own guns legally, use them safely, and to be protected in your right to do so. I have no difficulty with that. But I think the National Rifle Association went beyond a group that stood for that basic principle and one that promoted gun safety, as Brad mentioned earlier, I believe Elizabeth too, and became a much different political organization. What always used to trouble me the most when I was running and would run into someone who was in the NRA or really what I considered to have taken a pretty extreme view on the issue, I would give them the riff I gave you. Well, if you want to use a gun for legitimate hunting purposes, store it safely, target practice, or self-defense, I don't have any problem with that. And they would say to me, you don't understand. This isn't about any of those things. This is about my right to have a weapon to protect myself if the government turns on me. They say that. You can hear that. And what they're saying is, it is about my ability to shoot the policeman at my door, or to shoot a member of the National Guard who's walking my street. That's what they're saying. And that goes way beyond anything envisioned in the Second Amendment or the Heller decision as far as I'm concerned. So I think the NRA is fostering that kind of manic approach to what is a fundamental use of a firearm by people who do it safely.
The one thing I'll add is separate the NRA as the lobby organization, the people you see on TV, Wayne LaPierre, I forget the name of the woman who was at the town hall. They're the people, they are actually the lobby of the gun manufacturers. And your neighbors are the people you might know at work who are members of the NRA. I have had roundtables where we talk about gun violence. There have been NRA members there have been victims of gun violence, activists in the gun violence prevention movement. And we come to common ground at the very beginning. It doesn't take to the very end to get there. The idea of having sensible gun safety laws that protect all of us as a community, that reduce the incidence of suicide, the things we can do to make steps forward. I would say over the last couple of decades, maybe a little bit longer, but not much, the NRA has been hijacked by gun manufacturers from the people who the Senator mentioned, people with the tradition of grandparents and parents taking their kids out, teaching them life skills, safety skills, responsibility, whether it's in hunting or target shooting. And those are not traditions that we are attacking or should want to. It is this other issue of making it impossible for us to keep our kids safe in their communities, at their schools, or in theaters.
There's a question here from someone in the community who was active in trying to get an assault weapons ban enacted by our city council as a result of the Circuit Court of Appeals ruling. It was a short window, 2 weeks. Efforts were made to put a placeholder, and the city council declined to do that. In light of all that's transpired since 2015, is there anything that can be done at the federal level so that this issue can be brought before the city council again? And I know it's a local issue, but that's how the question is framed. And what, if anything, can be done?
I'm aware of Highland Park and there are other communities that are.
Highland Park passed it during it was a 10-day window, wasn't even
Yes.
2 weeks. Highland Park passed it at that moment. Deerfield put the marker down and passed it this year, but I'm not sure what other communities. But again, at the federal level, until we change
Congress.
Congress, it's not going to happen.
The city attorney for Highland Park is a friend of mine, and there are other communities that have contacted him about ways to approach this. And I don't know if there is a way to do it, but I certainly encourage it as much as possible.
Thank you. Okay, I have one more for Elizabeth, and then we'll take one more for our elected officials. Elizabeth, do you plan on continuing your action on this issue when you get to college, and how do you see yourself doing that?
The short answer is yes. I don't have it completely planned out yet, but I'll be in DC, so there'll be marches. I can attend.
We have plans.
And they have plans. They have plans for me. Yeah, I would love to have an internship. I'm just kidding.
We have a written test, but you passed the oral test.
So, yeah, working, in Congress and writing for the newspaper at Georgetown. That's been the most influential experience of my high school career, so I definitely plan to continue with that and make my voice heard in whatever ways I can.
I'm going to combine some of these questions so we can finish up on time. It's framed under how did lobbyists get to be so powerful, and why is it legal for politicians to accept their money? And I think we've heard a lot about that, but how can we find out what contests are being supported by the NRA so that we can contribute to the person who is for reasonable gun control? Is anyone able to answer that question?
I think Gavin Gifford's organization, which changed its name, look at you, do you remember what it became? It was American, Gifford Law Center, thank you. It was very difficult. Gifford Law Center, I think is keeping a log, but I'm not sure, but you can find that online. So there are campaign finance laws. Individuals are allowed to give it to a certain limit for primary and general. PACs, you can only give so much to a PAC, and PACs can only give so much to a candidate, and all of that is transparent. And there's issues around that. We can spend a whole evening talking about that. But the real problem is the dark money. And I mentioned the 3 races with me and Bob Dole, $60 million. Well, between the 2 individual campaigns over the 3 years, we raised less than half of that. Most of that money came from outside. Some of that money came from organizations attacking me or attacking Bob. It was on both sides. No one knew who they were. I couldn't tell you who they were. I couldn't tell you what interest they represented. They just had a keen interest in making sure one or the other wasn't getting elected, and that's happening all across the country. That's why it's so important that we have that transparency. We also have transparency, like there was articles today about it, the concern about foreign powers trying to influence our election, and unfortunately the current administration seems reluctant to take any action. We need to secure our elections and make sure that we have a robust election process the technical infrastructure aspects that can defend against these intrusions, can identify them quickly when they're identified, stop them, and recover immediately without any damage. And that takes both a federal and local effort. But that's off the subject of the question, but it's something I worry about as well.
Senator Durbin?
Again, I know this is a nonpartisan organization, but if anyone would like to stick around afterwards, I can tell you of 3 or 4 congressional races in this state where you could support a candidate who favors gun safety over someone who is supported by the NRA.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists, Elizabeth Porter, Congressman Brad Schneider, and Senator Dick Durbin for their wonderful presentation today and being so accessible to us all and answer our questions. I want to thank you for attending and being here and being present and offering your questions. As a plug for the League, we do accept voter registrations. We do accept members starting at age 16. And I think what has resonated here profoundly from all of our speakers is that none of this discussion matters if you don't vote. So we hope we see you when we're poll watching throughout Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. We hope we see you all at the polls, unless you don't live in Lake Forest and that don't count, because we'll sketch. But thank you so much for your time this evening. We hope you will join us on May 19th at a program we're sponsoring with Lake Forest High School on recent developments in climate change policy, obstacles and opportunities. The speakers are Tom Skilling from WGN, Professor Donald Wubbles, who is the atmospheric science professor and presidential fellow at University of Illinois and worked in the Obama administration's Executive Office for Climate Change, and Mary Gady, a former regional EPA administrator in the Bush administration. So we hope you will join us. There will be an expo before and after the program at the high school of student projects reflecting climate change problems and opportunities, as well as over 10 community groups who are going to be sharing what they're doing in the area of climate change. So come to the high school at 3:30 for the expo and 4 o'clock to 5:30 for the program. We hope you'll join us. Thank you to you all. Safe travels home. Good night.